Hi, folks. We want to offer a quick trigger warning. We want everybody to find what is useful here, but this is, in fact, a podcast about trauma. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself while you're listening to the Whole Again podcast. Thanks.
Hi, and welcome back to the Whole Again podcast, the podcast that comes with a tea recommendation. And this time, it is a green dragon well. First flush, if you can get it, 185-degree water, about 30 seconds. It'll change your life. I'm Teddy, and with me is my co-host, Leslie.
Hi, everybody.
We've come to the final statement of season 1. We can be whole again.
And thank you for those of you that have been here on this whole journey. For those of you just joining us on this episode, welcome. It's certainly helpful to head back and catch the others, but don't let us stop you from having dessert first. As a reminder, the 5 statements of the framework are as follows. 1. We begin whole. Our birthright includes safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, fundamental needs of all beings. 2. Trauma and healing are embodied across 5 layers: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and historical. 3. Trauma is the harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. 4. Trauma overwhelms. Trauma overwhelms our ability to cope with and integrate the emotions, thoughts, and sensations connected to an experience. And 5, here we are. We can be whole again. Pathways to healing occur anytime we do anything that rebuilds safety, agency, dignity, and belonging.
So pathways to healing occur anytime we do anything that rebuilds, restores, or promotes safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. And do we mean like anything? Like, yes, anything. And that doesn't mean that one single moment of connection or one act of safety or some small bid for agency will make a person whole again. But altogether, they do, right? They are geometric, as we've talked about before. Like, healing is a thing that builds upon itself. And there are a couple of things that I want to say up top, right? When we were building this framework, this was not the piece that we thought about the most.
Oh.
And part of what that means to me is that it was more inspiration or intuition than kind of carefully constructed word choice, right? Like the others. And the meaning is really clear, right? We can be whole again. This isn't I can be whole again. The framework isn't individualist, which means that I cannot actually be whole without you also being whole. So when I take steps toward wholeness, toward wellness, it's only partially an inside job, and I have to make way for you to also be on that pathway for yourself. The second thing that I want to highlight here, and I think we may have mentioned this in episode 1 that I don't really recall, is this distinction between healing and curing. And Rachel Naomi Remen has this really great book called My Grandfather's Blessings, and she talks about this distinction that curing is mostly thought about as a return to a prior state, kind of backwards look, or a prior state of wellness that doesn't exist anymore in this moment of dis-ease, right? And when we're talking about healing, when we're seeking healing, we know that we won't actually be the same. This isn't a backwards looking project. This is forward looking. This is, I will be whole again on the other side of this harm, and I will be whole differently, but I will be whole. So we're not looking to a kind of pre-existing fantastic fantasy or imagined time when all things were well, either individually, collectively, or structurally or systemically. What we're looking toward is, as we rebuild these things, as we make sure that our fundamentals are in place, even if right now they're really not, we can still be whole again on the other side of that. What that means is that we don't have to wait in this kind of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder way for a post for us to have that healing, but we're saying, no, actually, you can heal in this moment, even as those traumatic conditions are persisting, right? We can still be whole again, even in the midst of that harm.
So for me, statement 5 is the most actionable part of the framework. Remember from earlier episode, this idea that bodies take action. They move, they grow, evolve, and they're influenced by the conditions they're growing in, right? Those social nutrients of safety, agency, dignity, and especially belonging. We've referenced this phrase, the neurons that fire together wire together. And this is kind of like a companion idea to pathways to healing. As Teddy just said, one moment of belonging or connection alone is typically not sufficient for healing, but it is a step forward. With more of those steps, it becomes a practice. With practice, we transform. We become what we practice. And pathways to healing really can happen anytime. This is contrary on purpose, very much on purpose, to the idea that healing mostly happens in therapy, in a medical space, or maybe church or a spiritual setting if that's your jam. For many of us fortunate enough to still live in relative economic stability, there's often abundant opportunities for healing all around us. For those in more dire conditions, pathways to healing still exist, but are fewer and typically more fraught or dangerous. But healing is always possible because healing can be in our relationships with people, animals, and the planet itself. Healing can be in our participation and the actions that we choose to take or not take. Healing can be what we choose to give our attention to. Healing can be in the quality of presence with which we move through the world. Trauma and healing are rooted in culture, and these pathways are going to look really different for different people. What is actually meaningful and impactful for the person can be really specific to this person. Some folks might be rolling forward and not walking. Some folks have a mental health situation that is permanent in some way. And yet, we can still all be whole again. All of us.
For me, one pathway is a doorway to the next, right? They reinforce one another and can have a buffering effect. So I can resist my threats to agency if my belonging is especially robust. And I want to talk a little about forging new paths versus revisiting well-worn paths. And we can think about this across all the layers. The distinction that we make in the framework when we talk about trauma and what trauma is, right? It is this interruption. And so the thing that I think can get confusing for folks in this current moment is that people describe feeling triggered. And without getting too far down this kind of academic or kind of conceptual frame around what is a trigger and how does it do all of its things, what's important to note is that when we say triggered, typically we're talking about the recollection of a traumatic experience or event that is pulled forward through time into our current body. So it doesn't mean that I'm being actively traumatized at that moment, but there might be a thing that makes me, the me that is my nervous system, recall a similar event that I've survived in the past and reach for the things that helped me survive in that last moment. So when people talk about their kind of fight, flight, freeze response showing up at a time that is inconsistent with their current environment because of a smell or a sight or a sound, that's the triggering that's happening, which is different from the trauma that may have happened, right? That kind of acute trauma that we describe. And the reason that we need to make this distinction is that there are so many things that are happening that are traumatizing. And so the space between, well, am I being actively traumatized by poverty, right? Or am I being triggered by this particular moment in which these kind of forces are coming to play, right? Where I can't provide for my children because of the economic reality I'm in, or where I can't have a safe place to live, right? Because I'm in that poverty. So there are things that are kind of persistent traumatic conditions, and then there are things that are triggers. And while they are not the same, it's important to understand how they're related. And so when we say we can be whole again, it doesn't mean that we will never be triggered again, but it does mean that I can, in some ways, have a little bit of measurement around where am I at in this healing? If the things that used to be triggering for my nervous system are less triggering, are less present, less frequent, right? We talked about frequency and intrusion the last episode. So if I have an experience that used to trigger my nervous system's threat response, threat reaction, and now when I have the experience, it doesn't happen, that is one measure of healing. It's not the only measure, but it's a helpful one to keep in mind when we talk about that relationship again between kind of what's triggering and what's traumatizing, when we talk about being on this kind of pathway to healing and to wholeness.
So if we boil it all the way down, there seems to be two parts that are elemental or foundational for healing. And the first is this idea of bearing witness, and some of the time creating a record of the harm, but we're going to focus on bearing witness. And the second thing is restoration, which we're going to talk about in terms of rebuilding safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. To bear witness can be as simple as being present and connected to someone who is sharing a traumatic experience with you. The thing is, we are all witnesses for each other, whether we know it or not, and whether we choose it or not. This is sort of part of the deal with being socially complex herd animals. The question is how we do it. Over the years, many, many people have told me, well, I did tell someone once, and it went really terribly. And so I never talked about it again, until now. So why, after 20 years in the trenches of trauma and healing, do I think that bearing witness is so important? Because I've seen it in large and small ways over and over and over again, and how it transforms bodies. Someone who finally, after years of keeping a terrible secret, finally shares it with someone and then feels profoundly unburdened afterwards. Someone who holds themselves with more dignity after a trusted person shares how much they appreciate them. Someone who feels a deeper sense of agency after learning a new skill or practice. And someone who is more calm and grounded in a relationship where they feel seen and can make mistakes and still feel worthy of love and belonging and the care and protection of the collective. Being seen is what people experience when we bear witness. It's really two sides of the same coin. Us bearing witness is the action needed for folks who need to feel seen. Most of us on some level have a need to feel seen. I would say all of us, barring some kinds of personality disorders. But I think we're much, much less adept at the bearing witness part. And honestly, that makes sense. It's really hard to bear witness to suffering. It's hard to bear witness to it, especially when we might be or think we might be the cause of that suffering. It's really hard to bear witness to suffering when you cannot do anything to change those conditions, like the death of a loved one. It's hard to bear witness if you're anxious or unsure whether or not you can do anything to change those conditions. And I think this is a situation many folks are finding themselves in around the climate catastrophe and this current social political time that we're in together.
I will say that witnessing it's hard work, right? So when Octavia Butler in Parable of the Sower writes about the empathy, hyper empathy of the main character, the skill that she develops is to essentially take, I think she calls them visual sips, right? The thing that she knows is that with her condition, if she witnesses too much suffering, she will experience it in her own body and it takes her out. So when she witnesses someone experiencing really egregious physical harm, she feels that in her body and her body reacts to it. And so what she learns how to navigate other people's suffering is by glancing, right? Like taking in a little at a time, enough to know what's happening and not so much that it takes her out. There are lots of things that Octavia has to tell us about how to navigate this moment, but that is one that I want to make sure that folks really witness, really value, right? Really take on, that we can take it in a little at a time so that it doesn't overwhelm our nervous systems. The other thing that is really crucial about bearing witness is that you are witnessing, like you are in the seat of power in some way to really be with someone else's suffering without trying to pull them out of it immediately, without trying to solve someone else's problem, without feeling inadequate because you can't end poverty or end climate change or all of these things. You're like, oh, I have to be with this person in the thing that they're in and really hold that I don't want them to be in that situation. I don't want them to be in that condition. I don't want that thing to have happened to them. And I may not be able to do anything to stop it at this moment, but I can still long for that. I can still want that for them. So we have to have this witnessing that is both creating space for someone to tell the story, whatever that story may be, and for that story to be heard, right? To be taken in. And we're really not great at it. The thing that I support folks in doing, particularly when we're doing healing and transformative justice work, is that piece around giving like an inordinate amount of agency to someone who is being witnessed. When we do this practice in circle, we will literally ask folks, do you want people to look at you or not? How close do you want people to sit to you? Do you want anything to eat or drink? Do you want to tell the story fast or slow? Do you want questions afterwards or do you not want questions afterwards? Do you want people to hug you after or do you want folks to leave you alone or give you a little space? And if that changes, let us know, right? Like to really dial up how much power they have, how much authority they have over their own story, because so much of people's traumatic experiences are really them not having authority, them experiencing powerlessness, right? Them not being able to do or control or escape or keep themselves safe. So the more that we can load up on in however you want to offer it. You get to make all the choices. Even that gives a little bit of agency back to them. So even that small act of witnessing in that way allows them to have a little bit more agency back, puts them a little bit like one more move further on that path. And then after they've, shared this experience with you and you still care for them and you haven't disappeared, then they also get to have a little bit of that belonging. And as Leslie was saying, if they're able to unburden themselves and stand a little taller, right, to have a little bit more of their dignity back, then that's another move on that path. So we can do this witnessing not only in, right, these like very specific clinical settings, come and sit on my couch, but when we're sitting next to each other on the couch and watching this thing or that thing or playing with this thing or that thing, like we can still have that, right? Someone can still experience being witnessed even if we have like video game controllers in our hands, like it's possible there.
So these two components of healing, right, of bearing witness and of restoration. And so this is what we're going to talk about in the next section of rebuilding our fundamentals: safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. And we're going to go through each of the fundamentals and talk a little bit about what it means to feel with those fundamentals and give some examples of what pathways to healing might look like at each of the layers. So we'll start with safety, because safety is first, not really by priority, just sort of how we always said the set of words.
Safety first.
Safety first, unless you're in the safety third camp, but that's okay. So what does it mean to feel safe? In the formal definition, we talk about having an internal sense of security: physical security, mental, emotional security, financial security. And so when we think about what would make us feel safer, I feel like this is a place where there's a huge amount of distortion in the political conversation or in our social conversations, right? We're feeling fundamentally unsafe, but the, policies and laws that are coming to bear or coming into existence to respond to that lack of safety, I think is really questionable whether or not it's going to get us more safety, right? So we talked about in one of the earlier episodes, safety means different things to different people, right? You might be prioritizing physical safety or mental emotional safety or community safety or environmental safety or financial safety, right? So safety means different things to different people. But part of what also happens is that like we confuse it, right? So we go, well, safety means this for me, and so it must also mean this for you. And this is really the source of a lot of disconnection for folks. I had someone in a class after teaching this say, "You just described an argument that I've been having with my partner for 10 years. We both work and we have saved some money, and I would like to do things like travel and work on our house. And my partner never wants to spend any money. And so we argue about it sometimes. I grew up relatively middle class. My partner grew up without a lot of economic resources. And so I realized in this training that having money in our savings account is safety to him. I never needed things, so it was never an issue of safety for me. And so I've just been thinking he's been being stubborn or being difficult or being rigid in some way. It never once occurred to me that this was actually tied to their sense of safety, right? So these are two people just in a relationship, living their lives, walking around with completely different definitions of safety, causing, occasional conflict and kind of inhibiting their ability to connect on what safety means for them. So what are some examples of building safety at some of the other levels? So we're going to kind of rattle off some examples in this section. We'll dig into some of them more than others. But part of our general idea with this project is that there are really countless pathways to healing. So at some point, we would love to have a website where people just come and kind of blog with us. How are you building pathways to safety, agency, dignity, and belonging in your life? So we'll give a few examples, but know that it is in no way intended or meant to be an exhaustive list. So we need to really figure out how to build some different community safety strategies, right? And so those might be mutual aid, restorative or transformative justice, figuring out how to increase security in our built environments and virtual environments. But the reliance on systems is not going to be the only or best pathway to safety. We need to make it safe and okay in families and groups to make mistakes, to take risks, and to take accountability when needed. Right? We talked about agency as being able to make a choice, experience reasonable consequences, and then make another choice. But that really requires a safety container where you can make those mistakes and take those risks and still be worthy of love and belonging, even when we mess up, and that there's models for us to be able to take accountability. So some things we can think about for building systemic safety would be providing affordable, accessible, universal housing and healthcare, including behavioral healthcare, which I could do a whole separate podcast on and might someday, but not today. And regulating and reducing the amount of firearms and how people access firearms. Some examples of building safety at a historical or intergenerational level would really involve extensive efforts to decrease domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. So many of the traumas that I have heard about are rooted in one of those kinds of violence, right? And they're really pervasive, right? As much as there are attempts out there to respond to things like domestic violence and child abuse, our ability to actually decrease those things, needs a full-scale effort. And then at the intergenerational level, outlouding safety, right? Naming harm, interrupting patterns, and building new practices within families and across generations.
Yeah, I think that that tension that you named kind of at the beginning around what feels safe to me may not feel safe to someone else, and what we reach for when we're reaching for safety. And, when you named the piece around firearms, right, that for many people, so again, my background is, I came up in this work working with young people, many of whom were exposed to gang violence or involved with gangs, and would often say, I am carrying this weapon for my safety. Like, this is a protective measure. And that only makes sense in the context of structural violence, right? So if their safety was guaranteed, then they wouldn't feel like they needed to carry a weapon to keep themselves individually safe or even collectively safe. And what we know about firearms is that they tend to make folks less safe. And I mean that both in terms of carrying one, but also just having one in our homes. We know that most folks who are dying by firearms are dying from suicide, right? So what we know there is that even in that moment, right, that it is a thing that is creating more danger and taking more safety away. And even the example that you were sharing about, people who are in this conflict around money, right? Same story, right? If we had the systemic safety, if we had universal basic income, if we had universal health care, if we had universal quality education, early childhood education, if we had these things in place, then everyone would have more money to go on vacation, right? Like, we wouldn't feel like our very survival was so tied up in this exchanging hours for dollars.
Right.
So again, like, the individual ways in which we wind up navigating these things and feeling or experiencing kind of an over responsibility for our own individual safety is always in the context of whose relative safety is prioritized by our kind of systemic arrangement. So individually, right? So I think about agency as you were saying, right? Our ability to make decisions, experience reasonable consequences, and then make subsequent decisions. So what it takes to express one's agency, I always think of as being attached to my safety, right? If I'm safe enough to try something, knowing that I may make a mistake, leave that in, that I'm safe enough to try something, knowing that I may make a mistake, I'm willing to take the risk, right? But if I don't have that safety in place, then it's much more difficult for me to experience and express my agency. So again, these kind of doorways and pathways are linked. At the individual level, having emergency plans, having a go bag, again, shout out to Octavia, having agreements with loved ones around what happens if my agency is compromised, right? Those are things that I can do individually to really support my sense of my ability to do things and affect change in my environment, in my immediate environment. Collectively, there's so many ways that we can support one another in having that kind of agency. So again, we can create more opportunities for people to feel safe, right? So mutual aid, all the things. We can have cultures of consent, right? The extent to which we are raising a generation of young people right now who may have a much clearer sense of consent, particularly around their own bodies, certainly than when I was a young person. And so much of that is because of all the really amazing organizing of folks who, many of whom are survivors of childhood sexual abuse, who are like, we need to have a culture of consent, particularly for children, because that stuff starts so early, right? Like, literally letting your child say, like, no, I don't want you to hug or kiss me right now, allows them to have enough bodily autonomy in that moment that it will translate into all these other places, right? So really building cultures of consent. I dedicate a lot of my kind of time and energy and resource to transformative justice work, which means collectively setting up conditions for people who have been harmed and who have caused harm to experience a transformation that is non-punitive, right? That is non-carceral, that isn't about excluding them or voting them off the island or removing them from all of their relationships, right? It is about saying, we are all in here. Harm has happened amongst all of us, and we all have a responsibility in setting it right. Let's try some things to make that right.
One of my personal soapboxes, I talk about hashtag all roads lead to campaign finance reform. So this would be talking about pathways to healing at a systemic or at a political level. And what we mean by this is that any issue that we care about, at least in the United States in 2025 and the current system of government and political landscape we have, we can't really truly have agency at a systemic level with political candidates, 95% of whom have been bought and paid for by lobbyists, by industries, by billionaires.
Yeah, and it's an imbalance, right? Some folks in this current arrangement have a lot more agency than others. And the way that they've gotten that, right, is because they've taken it. So rather than having a situation in which we all have some sort of collective agency and then we are able to influence our systems with that collective agency, there are some very small number of people who have an outsized influence, who have an outsized amount of agency to influence those systems to their liking. And and it's an imbalance, right? It's imbalance is probably not dramatic enough of a word, but like is really out of line in terms of how we are supposed to have agency inside of any kind of democratic system, setup, or institution.
So Teddy did my soapbox better than me today, and that's fine. I'm good with that. I think all roads still lead to campaign finance reform. Okay, so let's talk about dignity. So having taught this for a long time now, one of the things that I really observe in rooms when we're doing this work is that dignity, I think, is the most tender of these. When you start talking about building dignity or even talk about dignity, I notice people start to shift in their chairs a little bit and like look away. And I personally think that this is because we're living in a really undignified culture, right? I think that late stage capitalism is profoundly undignified. I think hustle and grind culture are profoundly undignified. I think that the idea that we shame ourselves for needing to rest or get sick is really all hits on our dignity. And so what can we do to rebuild dignity? We start with affirming people, right? Use specifics, include yourself, look in the mirror. We talked earlier about bearing witness, and I think that one of the things that is fundamental to bearing witness is really about being able to sit in that place of suffering with somebody bearing witness and non-judgment that really, really rebuilds dignity in like a really fundamental way. Also, naming emotions, normalizing all people having access to a full range of emotions. And let me say that again for the folks in the back. All people of all genders having access to a full range of emotions that are not policed or shamed or squandered or shoved down. And then the last thing I'll say here, the advertising-based business model that we're living in, I also think really damages our dignity, right? I think we get pervasive messages that we're not good enough and we don't look good enough, we're too young, and basically we're just doing it all wrong. And there's a product that you can buy that will make you do it right or better or smoother or prettier or younger or whatever. But it just like walk through the world or listen to a commercial and really just feel like the hit to the dignity.
An advertising-based economic model, an advertising-based tax model, right? So if you were in class with me when I was teaching at the university, you would have gotten really tired of hearing me talk about the tax system. And part of it is that we decide what to do with taxes as a separate thing, but deciding what to tax, like what gets taxed and what our tax structure looks like, is its own thing. And the things that are tax exempt, like if you're a business and you spend a bunch of money on advertising, you don't pay taxes on that money that you spend doing advertising, right? So you are encouraged to put your money in that direction, right? That's how those things are set up. secondarily, I live in a state where the tax law was really high on income taxes and really high on sales taxes and very low on property taxes because the tax law was set up when some people owned other people and they didn't want to pay taxes on the people that they owned. So they made sure that the law in that state and the states around it didn't tax property at a high rate. Those tax policies were then copied as folks moved out here into the West. So if you look at the tax law in Washington, Oregon, California, and some of these other places, it's modeled on Confederate tax law. So when we think about what is being taxed and what isn't, for me, it's always, always, always like scratch the surface just a tiny bit and see the racism underneath there. And so part of the restoration of dignity is both telling that story, right? Like allowing folks to recognize the ways in which themselves, their ancestors, their legislators, like everyone was kind of in on this game of taking people's dignity. That something as simple as, what's our tax policy on this thing or that thing, like has at its core some really deeply problematic and dignity destroying practices. So part of that restoration of dignity really is saying, oh, we need to change our tax laws, right? Like no one who walked into the podcast today was like, what we're going to talk about is how like reforming tax law and reforming campaign finance is a way to get us closer to being whole. But it is, right? When we think about that again at the systemic level, at the historic level, how do we make these things right or righter than they are now? Like that is a path.
Right, we've come to the last, perhaps our favorite. I know you're not supposed to have a favorite, but belonging probably is. What's belonging, Teddy? Teddy is the belonging-based Teddy.
I'm the belonging-based Teddy.
You're the belonging-based Teddy.
So we talk about belonging as being kind of a full member of whatever association you're a part of, right? So that might be a small group of friends, it might be a family, it might be my relationship with the planet, with my region, what have you. And at the individual level, right, that is often how it shows up. That we do that kind of in this individual way. How are we turning toward one another? How are we expressing belonging? My individual responsibility in building belonging is to be my own authentic, actual self, because I can't belong in a counterfeit way. If my authentic self isn't belonging, then I'm actually, robbing someone of belonging to me or belonging together. So there is a requirement for me to have some level of authenticity in that belonging, in that relationship. So that is I put that one up high, right? Like individually, collectively, when we talk about belonging, so many ways to build it. Again, a lot of the time that I have on this planet at this moment is supporting folks in circle and in transformative justice spaces. And in those spaces, when you have people come together and come in a circle and have these really amazing experiences, to a one, folks will say, I wish that everywhere could be circle. I wish that everywhere could be like this. I wish that all of my relationships could be like this. And I'm like, they can be, right? Like that is an aspiration that I hold. It is a belief that I have that we have what we need to have transformed relationships if we have supportive places to really grow those. So collectively, the more that we're engaged in building the kinds of relationships of belonging that we want to see more of, the more that we will have those. I also think about those moments that Leslie talks about of like collective effervescence, right? When are we singing together? Another shout out to Cole Arthur Riley, who just wrote Black Liturgies. The analysis that she offers on liturgy is that there's something that happens when we speak together. We are herd animals. So when we speak together, when we sing together, and when we're in it together in that way, there's something there's something transformational that happens inside of our own physiology and the physiology of others. So that collective experience, that collective effervescence, that collective practice, right? All of those things are things that build belonging.
If I could add quickly to that, collective effervescence is that feeling that you get when you are in circle or in group or in community with others that feels a little transcendent. But I think it can come through two paths, right? I think there's collective joy, which would be the singing, laughing, dancing, and there is collective struggle, and that is crying and mourning and building when the conditions are difficult. And having been in situations of both collective joy and collective struggle, feel like they both do the thing, right? They do it differently. It has a different valence to it, but they both get you to that other side that says, we have more trust and cohesion, right? I see you in a different way. I have a deeper well of trust here. I have a deeper sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes to all of that. And it's what I want to see when I think about our kind of systemic belonging, right? Like, what does it look like if we belong enough civically, like at that systemic level, that I can trust you, right? That we can trust one another in that larger space, that we are trusted, and that we belong to each other, that we belong to one another. We turn toward one another when things are hard, when we're in that suffering, knowing that we can get some resonance there, some witnessing there. And I think at that civic level, in that body politic way, it's really absent. Like, we don't have a lot of that systemic belonging. That's not what's built in at this moment. And it's not particularly well supported. But so many of the things that we're talking about in that safety bucket, right? Those universals, right? Universal healthcare, universal basic income, making sure everybody has enough to eat, everybody has a place to live. Like, those are ways in which we create systemic belonging, right? Those are ways in which we say, you belong here. We are going to take care of you. We're going to take care of one another. And again, we pass laws, including tax laws, that will do that thing.
So it seems like a good time to talk a little bit about Truth and Reconciliation committees.
Make it so.
Make it so. So I said in one of the earlier episodes that there weren't very many examples of Truth and Reconciliation committees that we could just like name off the top of our head. And while there weren't very many that I could name off the top of my head at that time, it turns out I was wrong. It's not that there have been like hundreds or thousands of Truth and Reconciliation committees, but there have been over 50 of them in the past, say, 60-ish years. As I learned more about them, it became clear that Truth and Reconciliation committees address trauma at a couple of layers. 2 layers specifically that I kind of just tracked as sort of a trend. First, after a current civil war or a substantial civil conflict of some type. And secondly, to address historical traumas that were rooted usually in colonization, slavery, or genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And deeper reading showed that all of these efforts, right? I read a little bit about a bunch of them and was like, what did they do? What did it entail, right? What would it look like? And to be clear, part of the thinking here is that we might benefit here in the United States from a Truth and Reconciliation Committee about the history of slavery and the history of colonization or genocide here in our own culture that our own roots are rooted in. And so what would it look like to do that here? And so they all seem to have, sometimes they use different words, but they all seem to have some core components. The first is bearing witness and creating a record. So we talked earlier about bearing witness, and I said, and sometimes creating record. But this seemed to be the very first step in virtually every Truth and Reconciliation committee I looked at. In some Truth and Reconciliation committees, there were 20 or 30,000 different statements taken. Now think about what that means in the history, or think about what that means in the aftermath of something like a civil war or an attempted genocide. That a group of people went out to record and bear witness to 20,000 different people recounting their narrative of what happened. And I thought, that's just such a huge undertaking. But there is a deep need that people have to bear witness and to have there be a record, because the second part is taking accountability, right? And really the theme that you hear again and again is, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And so those 2 pieces of creating a record and bearing witness really are in service not only of, bearing witness to the people who experienced the harm at the time, but creating a record so that we have something to reflect back to so that this doesn't happen again. And then there's some sort of reconciliation or remediation, right? Again, it depends on the place and the project and the people and all sorts of things. But in the United States, we can look at legal remediation examples, including the Supreme Court cases of Brown versus Board or the Obergefell decision. Of course, it is important to say that, Supreme Court decisions may change in the near future.
Mileage may vary.
Mileage may vary, understatement of the day. But at the time, these were legal remediations for prior systemic, long-term, widespread harm. In legislation, we might look at the Voting Rights Act, which we talked a lot about in episode 2, the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, which also probably going to get blown up. And another example is this project called Reconnecting Communities, right? So we talked about the legacy of redlining in one of the earlier episodes. And in part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there is a small piece in there, buried in all of the other stuff, called the Reconnecting Communities Project. And what that project seeks to do is actually physically start stitching back the built environment that were separated during redlining, right? So it would look a little different based on the place, but actual federal money that was supposed to be dedicated to start, reconnecting those communities so that they can be whole again. At the cultural level, remediation sometimes is movement-based, right? Like Me Too or Occupy or the racial uprising and the response to the public execution of George Floyd. There's the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, the Orange Shirt movement, which is the missing and murdered Indigenous people's campaign in Canada. So all of these are serving to remediate, to restore, to create healing where none existed before, or to create new pathways to healing that address some of these really large, long-standing cultural harms that are rooted in historical trauma. So I asked you on one of our walk and talks recently, what does wholeness look like at the cultural level?
Mm-hmm.
And you had a great answer for me.
Now remember it. I think there's this piece around what it means to be in what many folks refer to as right relationship. I'm thinking about the definition of wellness that we use and that I really play with a lot from Emily and Amelia Nagoski's book, right? That ability to move fluidly from risk, adventure, etc., to safety and calm and back out again. And to me, so much of what I think about for what it is to be whole again at that kind of systemic level is that it's like, how do we get right enough that we can move fluidly into and out of those places and still come back to a place of relative safety and calm all together? Like, can we have calm enough nervous systems? There's so much, to me, so much creativity to be unlocked when we can settle the nervous systems enough in our, kind of collective body so that there's just so much more that we can do. And I do this work in school sometimes. And what we talk about is the reason that we do whole school responses and the whole school kind of implementation, whole school interventions is literally that. It's that we want to help everyone's nervous system chill out, right? If we can kind of lower the temperature on everyone, then the folks who really need extra support, we can actually see them. We can actually notice that that's what's happening. When everyone is on fire, right? When everything is explosive, when everyone is kind of under these threats and their nervous systems are overloaded, their gut microbiomes all over the place, right? Then our ability to respond to the really acute things that are arising is so limited, right? Like it's trying to, put out all these fires with 10 people spitting in a bucket or something. Like it is not meeting the need. But if everyone has more of what they need, right? If we have more, I think of it as mutual aid, but kind of more mutuality and more guarantees, more of our like basic needs met, then those things that are really acute, those the spikes of need become much more observable, and then we're much more resourced in how to kind of meet them.
So I want to go back to that word mutuality for a second and harken back to our first episode where we talked about an upside down rainbow with 5 layers and a plant growing out of the middle of it.
It's a great image.
So turned it into some cover art. So I think a lot about in terms of what we're rooted in. Like, what are our roots and what are they rooted in? And not to be fully existential, but maybe a tiny bit existential for a minute. I think that there are 2 deep roots. One that is rooted in dominance and another that is rooted in mutuality. And we're kind of struggling between those 2. And if I can be honest, it feels like dominance has been winning for the last 1,000 or so years. But I believe something else is possible, right? So, if we think about what are we feeding, right? Like sometimes you got to go in and do a root trim, but what are we feeding? What are those social nutrients? And then what is the nature of those really deep roots, those roots that go all the way down to that historical cultural layer? And we've talked about a lot of different things, and we've kind of given a little bit of lip service to capitalism. But I want to talk about capitalism as being part of the root of dominance, right? Of dominance and exploitation. I think many of us who are critical of shareholder capitalism and the incoming oligarchy, I think a lot of us feel like there's no options, right? It's either this awful version of capitalism that we're all grinding in, or we burn it all down, total anarchy. But perhaps we've lost our ability to imagine what another system or other versions of this system could look like. So why can't we build an off-ramp from capitalism, or at least this version of it? Why can't every single person living in the United States, or frankly on the whole planet, have a dignified existence provided to them with the extraordinary amount of wealth that is generated quarterly? We live in a post-scarcity world. We have for well over 50 years. And what we mean when we say post-scarcity is that there is enough food, building materials, water, healthcare, and basic resources to give a minimum dignified existence to every human being on the planet. We've been post-scarcity for several generations now. The only reason that people on this planet do not have their basic needs met is not an issue of resources, as it was prior to that. It is an issue of political will, right? It is an issue of our ability to get those resources to people in ways that are fair and equitable. So we could have nice things, or maybe not nice things, but we could all have a safe, dignified baseline that is available to everybody. So why don't we? What would it look like? Teddy's pulling from the book stack, everybody. This is very exciting. Nice okay, I'm done talking about capitalism. Teddy, read us a story and close us out.
So this is from Ruha Benjamin's book, Viral Justice, which I got from the library and now have to buy because I have too many little sticky notes all over it. And I really need to write in it. And I'm very opposed to writing in library books. So she's writing about kind of what is viral justice and what animates it. She writes, in its attention to everyday insurrections and beautiful experiments, radical designs for living, seeking, venturing, testing, trying, speculating, discovering, exploring new avenues, breaking with traditions, defying law and making it, viral justice expresses a deep longing that animates Black life. Viral justice is not about dystopia or utopia, but ustopia. As a world-building rubric, it is anticipatory and inventive, asking what if, while stubbornly invested in the here and now, demanding, why wait?
Why wait? So we can't have, we can't have nice things?
We can have nice things right now. Let's go.
Let's have nice things right now, Teddy. There's a lot on pathways to healing.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked some about bearing witness. We've talked about the pathways. We've talked about rebuilding safety, agency, dignity, and belonging across some of those layers. And we've tried to end with some high notes, really, of what else is possible, of how do we envision a whole world. And so like we do, we're going to close with some gratitudes and a little practice.
We've been on this journey for several episodes now, and today really in this moment of pathways to healing. And the practice to me really is to do that investigation. If you pick up Ruha Benjamin's book, she offers lots of expressions of what could be, of what wholeness and wellness could be, kind of lots of examples from all over the country in these different areas, and has this really beautiful way that she talks about plots and minding your plot. So know what your plot is, what's in your own backyard to tend to. I think we asked this in one of the previous episodes, but I'm going to ask it to kind of come in a little bit of a deeper layer. So not just minding our plots and not just plotting, right? But in our internal system, right? If you want to just start with you, you don't have to include anyone else, right? Just for you. What could you witness in yourself? What inside of you, inside of your current moment, inside of your history, inside of your own experience, inside of your life, could use some gentle witnessing? If you want to come along on this little journey, you can take a moment. Again, if you're operating heavy machinery, come back to this part of the episode later. But if you're out of time and a space where you can take a moment and do that very light investigation, where in my body and my psyche and my body brain and my history and my day and my emotional life, like where could I use some witnessing? And remember, witnessing is to observe without judgment, but with compassion, wishing that it could be another way. So find that place. If it's a physical place in your body, you can always lay a gentle hand there. Some gentle pressure can be really nice. And just send non-judgmental, loving care to that part of you. There's a whole tradition of self-compassion. We'll put some shit in the show notes for you. There's so much there, so much possible when we can offer just a little bit more room, a little more compassion, a little more kindness to ourselves and get us out of this need to judge and dominate, right? We even dominate ourselves, right? So to just be in a mutual, appreciative, grateful relationship and say, yeah, this too.
This too. So this brings us to the end of our 5 statements. Woo woo. Can't believe we did it. So on episode 6, we're going to do a little debrief, actually, of these first 5 episodes. And we're going to talk about what happens next with the Whole Again pod. So thank you so much to our listeners. Shout out to our sound engineer, Blake, in NAS Studios. Thanks to our producer, Sylvia at Sylvia Has Everything & Co. And a shout out to the land. We're here today in person together, which is always a real treat. And we're on the land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people. So thanks to the land for having us. Thank you to my collaborator, Teddy McGlynn-Wright, to the last 10 years. We made it. And thank you all. Take good care of yourself and take good care of the people around you.
Recommendation for tea. I'm not going to get it.
You're going to get it.
I'm going to
You're going to get it, and then we'll get the flow,
It's going to be
and
amazing.
that'll be great.
It's going to be amazing. It's going to be so good. So good.
Yep.